Anybody can make history. Only a great man can write it. Oscar Wilde. A very warm welcome to one and all present here. History and literature are common names for two obviously related but apparently distinct bodies of human activity. While history records human activities, literature endows it with life and vibrancy. Anyone who has read Manu as Pillai will agree that he dances between these two disciplines with ease. The various awards and recognitions that he has received, as well as his huge fandom, attest to this fact. Mr. Manu S. Pillai is the author of the award-winning book, The Ivory Throne, Chronicles of the House of Travancore, Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji, The Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, Tales from Indian History, and most recently, False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Varma. Mr. Manu S. Pillai formerly worked as a Chief of Staff to Dr. Shashi Tharoor MP. In the past, he has worked at the House of Lords in Britain, with Lord Karan Billamoria, CBETL, and also with the BBC on their history series called Incarnations, assisting Dr. Sunil Khilnani. His voice has reached millions through the columns in Mint Lounge, The Hindu, Open Magazine, The Times of India, Hindustan Times, The New Statesman, and other publications. He is an alumnus of Fergusson College, Pune, and is currently doing research at King's College, London. A big round of applause for Mr. Manu S. Pillai, whose presence has once again filled our halls with people in love with literature tinted with history. We are sure that we will witness many such gatherings in the future because of the rooted relationship between Manu S. Pillai and the Department of English. Without much ado, let me invite Dr. Preeti Kumar, Assistant Professor, the Department of English and Center for Research, to deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege for me to welcome you to this evening with the author and historian, sometimes known as South India's answer to William Dalrymple, Sri Manu S. Pillai. The Telegraph described him as the wonder kid among Indian historians, and his youth and boyish good looks.
Go on.
Not according to us. Not the way we see it. But to continue, his youth, and as I'm sure most of the ladies, young ladies here will attest, his boyish good looks will belie his vast erudition and his formidable achievements. But most importantly, more than the erudition and the accomplishments, he's been successful in bringing history into our living rooms, fleshing out the dry facts of history with stories of princes and priests and clerics and courtesans. His debut work of non-fiction, The Ivory Throne, on the royal family of Travancore, garnered immense and immediate popularity and was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017. His second work, Rebel Sultans, chronicles the story of the Deccan from the end of the 13th to the dawn of the 18th century. His third work, The Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, was a series of vignettes from history, stories of Englishmen who were who venerated Sanskrit, and the story of a photographer who also happened to be Jaipur's Maharaja. He continues with this motif of royalty in his latest book, which is the subject of the conversation today, False Allies, India's Maharajas in the Age of Ravi Varma, where he speaks about the role of the princes and princely states during the 18th and the 19th century. And he uses the travels of Ravi Varma to string the narratives together. It is with pleasure and it is a privilege to welcome Sri Manu S. Pillai, and on behalf of St. Teresa's College and this audience, I have immense pleasure welcoming you, sir. Our principal, the very genial Dr. Lissy Matthew, has always been appreciative and supportive of our many initiatives, and I welcome you to this gathering, ma'am. Sri Govind DC of DC Books, better known as the coordinator of Kerala, the Kerala Literary Festival, has long been a friend of St. Teresa's College, and he has been instrumental in this gathering today and our interaction with our speaker. I welcome you, sir, to this function. Our interlocutor for today is the head of the Department of English, Dr. Latha Nair, and it is her initiative that brings many functions such as these to fruition. On behalf of this audience, I welcome you, ma'am. And our audience, many thanks for your enthusiastic presence and your participation. I welcome you and wish you a very enjoyable evening ahead. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Sri Manu Pillai in conversation with Dr. Latha Nair. Thank you.
I now invite our dear principal, Dr. Lissy Matthew, to deliver the principal's address.
Writer and historian, Sri Manu Pillai, Sri Govind of DC Books, Head of the English Department, Dr. Latha Nair, other faculty members of the English Department, students of St. Teresa's College, and the invited guests. Good evening to one and all. It is one of our auspicious occasion for St. Teresa's College today, this evening, as we partake in this function of the book release of a renowned young writer, Sri Manu Pillai. As rightly stated by Dr. Preeti S. Nair, Preeti S. Kumar, he is a young, vibrant and enthusiastic writer, and she has given a good description about his creations. And of course, as you hear from him, the conversation between Dr. Latha Nair and this renowned writer, you will understand how eminent he is for the new generation. Dr. Preeti has given the details of his contributions. On behalf of this college, on behalf of the audience, I too express my congratulations to you, dear Manu Pillai, for all your achievements, the awards you have achieved, and also wish you the best in all your future endeavors. And this is a very good moment for St. Teresa's College to have this function here with a young, enthusiastic writer like you, and on this auspicious occasion, I congratulate the English department headed by Dr. Latha Nair for conducting this program, a program of this kind, so that the audience also get more to know about this young budding writer. And my sincere word of thanks to all the members present in the audience who will make this evening a wonderful session. Good wishes. Thank you all.
The floor is now open to the two charming people who will engage us for the next few hours with wit and wisdom. Over to you, Latha.
Good evening all. Am I audible? I really wish our roles were reversed in the sense Preeti was here as an interlocutor and I would have happily said the welcome address. But of course, I take this as an honor and my privilege to be in conversation with Manu Pillai, and I thank sincerely all those who have come to be with us today in this conversation, because it's the first time that we are having such a function after the pandemic. So I hope this is going to trailblaze and our department will be too happy to have similar conversations and similar interludes which will be definitely inspiring not only for the young people, young women, all young men and women who are waiting for this happening moment. And thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And we wish you, we hope that this is going to be an endearing conversation. So I think we can...
Thank you for having me and for all the kind words. I must confess that this calling me young is starting to grate a little bit simply because I've got rays even on my chin now. So I don't think, I think youth has now permanently left. We can just, assume that I am no longer young.
I think otherwise, I think what Preeti has suggested is that, her remark is absolutely true. You look charming as ever. And I think I will borrow lines from Shakespeare and say, it is about Cleopatra, but I think age...
I don't mind that. That I don't mind at all. I don't mind the comparison with Cleopatra. That I'll take. I don't want her eventual fate.
Yes. Age cannot wither him. So that is... So let us begin this conversation. And I think Preeti has given a very informative introduction about this. But I think that I would have my own comments about this particular book. As you all know, my students who are here, who is not a fan of this legendary writer, who is young again? And I think it was with the number of pages was a little daunting, but as I should confess, as I started reading the book, it became so engaging. I think when you look at the texture of his writing, I think language is like a tide. Language takes you like a tide. Through the entire pages, there is high tide and low tide, and language just attains perfection, I should say. And the emotions with which you engage each page is also different. India, as you all know, is a pluralistic society that creates magic with democracy, rule of the law and individual freedom, community relations and cultural diversity. Manu has proved that he is not only a genius historian, but also an organic intellectual who is here to rediscover India, the world's largest democracy. False lies like Rebel Sultan and Ivory Throne narrate the conflict-ridden history of this unnatural nation and unlikely democracy. As we turn the pages, the critical reader in you is overwhelmed by the magnitude of research that has gone into the making of this text. More than 200 pages of annotated research that help the author to narrate convincingly and deal with politics, economics, religion, language, caste and gender within the confines of 300 odd pages. Raja Ravi Verma, who captured the essence of native statesmen and Maharajas with flair and glamour, become the substance of the book, as Manu has fairly stated. I should confess again that it is a passionate and vigorous rendering of India's Maharajas in the age of Ravi Verma. Let me pose my first question. Why did you choose Ravi Verma?
I think in the introduction, part of that was already answered, which was that, when we speak of the princely states, that's 40% of the Indian subcontinent in terms of area. But they say, the British often said that there were 562 princely states. Sometimes they said 700, sometimes they said 565. So the number kept fluctuating simply because the classification kept fluctuating. But in reality, there were about 100 odd big states. They're the ones that merit the term state. We're sitting in what used to be a part of a princely state, Cochin. And say 1,000 square miles of territory, at least 10 lakhs in revenue, at least 1 million people. You discover that there are only about 100 odd princely states. Even so, I wasn't terribly keen to do some kind of a general book on everything as a kind of hodgepodge. So I was very keen to shortlist a few states, have something that would allow me to go into each within a degree of depth, with some kind of seriousness, rather than just looking at it from the surface. Which meant I had to select fewer states. And Ravi Verma was just useful there because the man was born in a princely state, he was descended from royalty, he was related to royalty, he was that ultimate insider. And he worked in multiple princely states. So he begins in Travancore in the 1860s. In the 1870s, he goes to Pudukkottai, which is in Tamil Nadu, ruled by Kallars. Then he goes in the 1880s to Baroda, which is Marathas, but in Gujarat. Then comes to Mysore, which is in Karnataka. And finally, before his death, a few years before his death, he ends up in Rajputana, which is all the way up north, a completely different style, a completely different structure of politics. And I thought, he was giving me, just by following his peregrinations, I was getting a very eclectic set of states, a very unique set of states. Each was different from the other. The castes of the rulers were different, their backgrounds were different, the internal political structures were different. So it was great. I didn't need to arbitrarily choose anything. I just had to follow one man, and he would deliver princely states on a platter to me, which I had then studied. That was the logic.
So, coming to Ravi Verma, I think the audience might also know that it was interesting to note that there was the absence of visual art in the Malayali psyche till Ravi Verma appeared on the scene. And I should say that Manu's writing reflects a tactile quality, which I found as a critique. I think it is the tactile quality of your writing and Ravi Verma's painting that creates a particular synergy of solid realism in this book. So as an artist, he has explored the malleability of the human body, and as a genius historian, you have perfected the art of envisioning counter history with hegemonic complexes of visuality. I would ask you the question, when we read the book, there is the imperial complex, nationhood complex, and modernity complex as the reader would confront. Were you conscious as a writer that you are going to situate Ravi Verma through this kind of complexities?
To a certain extent, yes, because you see, even when I was doing my first book on Travancore, the cliche on the princely states is it was all about dancing girls and elephants. It was about rajas keeping themselves on these silk cushions, on thrones, doing what they wanted, waking up in the morning, having some breakfast, watching some dancing girls, oppressing the people in the evening, that kind of a routine. But as I did my Travancore book, I discovered that in reality things were more complex. There was a lot that was happening. One way of encapsulating it is looking at a Rajput state. You see, there is the pressure from the British on the Raja. Then the Raja had his own idea of royalty, his own idea of kingship, which meant resisting that pressure to a certain extent. But the Raja was not a free bird. There were his vassal states which were also trying to check his power over them. So he had pressure from underneath as well. This is high politics. Then on the level of the masses, the Raja had to deal with hill tribes who were periodically orchestrating rebellions against his authority. He had to deal with Jat peasants who were not happy with the Rajput system, which meant that in one single state in Rajputana, the Raja not only did not have complete authority and power, there was no question of oppressing people left, right and center, because the people had ways of countering that kind of oppression. They would not put up with everything. The stereotype that the Rajas did nothing and they were just, from morning to evening, troubling people and being nasty to everybody, there are limits to that cliche. Of course, there must have been bad eggs, but there are bad eggs everywhere. Similarly, even the stereotype that it was all about dancing girls and palaces and jewelry and people dressed up in silks all the time, that's also overstated. Even their personal eccentricities. There was one Raja in Patiala who apparently had so many wives that when the Nizam of Hyderabad was called His Exalted Highness, this one was called His Exhausted Highness because he had far too many wives. But the thing is, those personal eccentricities, even if we take them at first face value, it wasn't just the Rajas who had them. Queen Victoria's son was a great playboy. In fact, I think there was an inside joke because he spent much of his time jumping from bed to bed as a young man. And I have a feeling that when he came to India, the Maharaja of Travancore presented him an ivory bed. He was making a little bit of a joke there. But that was Victoria's son. Lord Curzon, who was this very stiff upper lip, starchy back kind of person, lectured the princess constantly on being good. He as a young man played tennis stark naked. He jumped from bed to bed in his youth as well. So human beings behave in certain ways. I think to take some of those eccentricities, apply them to a political class as a political feature, that is colonial mischief. That was a narrative mischief meant consciously to belittle them, meant consciously to infantilize them, and create the impression that these guys are just people in fancy dress, they don't actually know how to govern, they're idiots, therefore the British have to help them. Therefore the British have to hold the brown man's hand and enable good governance, because these guys are no good. But in reality, it was more complex than that. There were good eggs and there were bad eggs. The book does not glorify the Rajas, it doesn't say they were all amazing, wonderful people, but it does argue that historically and politically they were interesting people. And they did have something of interest that we need to study, because without studying this 40% chunk of modern Indian history, how can we claim that we understood modern Indian history? It matters.
So what about the quote that you have given in the first page from Indira Gandhi, who said that the princely states, they did not do anything?
Yeah, go ask your Maharajas how many roads they built, and how many wells they dug, and how many canals they developed and all that. And she says that if you look at this, the sum total of their achievements, you'll see a zero. She was saying that, I think, in a 1967 election speech. Context is important there, and I use it as an ironic thing, because the book begins with that quote and then goes on to disprove that argument for the next 500 odd pages. But she was making that in an electoral setting, where of course the opposition parties, such as the Swatantra Party, was being funded by the princes with their privy purses, so she obviously had a political incentive there as well. But that's precisely why I put it at the beginning, that this is the idea of the princely states that we've got even now. Even now we think of them as people who were not part of India's modern experience. They were just these relics that somehow survived till 1949, and that they were wiped out, and that was that. But as the book argues, Indira Gandhi and many others had it a little wrong. They were a little biased in some respects, and I think we need a clearer, a more objective analysis of what was happening in the States.
So, and the same thing continued with Nehru as well. I think you have remarked that Nehru was a little bit cool, whereas Gandhi was also an organic intellectual who responded. Would you like to share something?
That's the thing. For the longest time, we assumed that nationalists and the Congress and the princes never got along, but it's actually the reverse. That if we take a 70-year period, say from the 1870s or 80s till 1947, you find that the princes and the Congress were actually friends for longer than they were enemies. It was only in the final 20 years that they fell out with each other. When the Congress was founded, one of their major sources of funding was the royal families. They were the ones giving them. Even after the British told the Rajas not to fund the Congress, they continued to give to the Congress. Curzon was interviewing the Maharaja of Baroda and discovered that Baroda was still giving. Baroda also financed Dadabhai Nauroji's election to the House of Commons in London, meant very consciously to aggravate the British, as it did. The governor of Bombay famously said that these natives can't govern themselves, how dare they get an election into the House of Commons. So obviously by funding that, the group of Maharajas who were helping Dadabhai Nauroji, they were making a political statement. Not only the Congress, the princes also funded a lot of regional nationalist clubs. The Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, which was considered full of diabolical and seditious people. They funded organizations and trusts like the Deccan Education Society, which ran a college called Ferguson College where I studied. But more importantly, at that time it used to attract a lot of revolutionaries. So when Maharajas were donating lakhs and lakhs of rupees to an educational institution known to harbor students with revolutionary sympathies, the British knew that they were in a sense, encouraging that kind of anti-British attitude. I don't argue that the Maharajas did this out of some grand love for the nation and that kind of thing. But it was an interesting political dynamic. They were not, the British came and became their overlords. It's not like they just laid down flat on the ground and said, okay, fine, you're our overlords, we won't complain. No, they had ways of resisting colonialism. And resisting colonialism wasn't just by street agitation. That in fact is the final phase where Gandhiji prepares the ground and achieves that. Till then, people had other creative, interesting ways of resisting imperial inroads, which could range from making incendiary speeches, where you talk about national government and national culture and all that, and then the British write to angry letters saying how dare you use the word national, or going abroad and meeting revolutionaries who've already been exiled from India. They're not allowed to enter India, and there you have a Maharaja going and happily chilling with these people. It could take sometimes interesting forms. There's an anecdote that's not in the book where Swati Tirunal of Travancore, എന്തോന്നൊരു മോശമായിട്ടുള്ള ഓർഡർ മേളിൽ വന്നു. അപ്പോൾ അത് വന്ന സമയത്ത് രാജാവിനോട് പറഞ്ഞു ഇങ്ങനെ ഇത് പ്രോക്ലമേഷൻ പബ്ലിക് ദർബാറിൽ റീഡ് ചെയ്യണം. രാജാവ് പറഞ്ഞു അയ്യോ ഇറ്റ്സ് വെരി എംബാരസിംഗ് പ്രോക്ലമേഷൻ, ഐ ഡോണ്ട് വാണ്ട് ടു റീഡ് ദിസ്. അപ്പം ലെറ്റ്സ് ഡു ദിസ് കോംപ്രമൈസ് ആയിട്ട് ഞാൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലുള്ള പ്രോക്ലമേഷൻ വായിക്കാം, മലയാളത്തിലെ വായിക്കുന്നില്ല. അപ്പോൾ ഐ വിൽ സേവ് ഫേസ്, യു ഗെറ്റ് വാട്ട് യു വാണ്ട് ആസ് വെൽ. And the British said, no, 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 not happening. Malayalam വായിക്കണം, വായിച്ചേ തീരൂ. അപ്പോൾ രാജാവ് hems and haws and finally said, ആയിക്കോട്ടെ, മലയാളം വായിക്കാം. Darbar order ചെയ്തു, Darbar arrange ചെയ്തു, 2 proclamations വന്നു, 2 വായിക്കുകയും ചെയ്തു. പക്ഷേ the moment it was done, the British resident wrote back to Madras that Raja is very clever. He made sure that the Malayalam proclamation was read, but made sure also that no Malayali was in the room when the proclamation was read. So these are, see, it's not resistance, as I said, by street agitation, but it is a form of constantly challenging the pressure that the colonial state was putting on you. It could take some very interesting, comical, petty kind of things. There was a Kochi Raja called Hoyne. He was asked once why he employed so many British people in the Cochin government as engineers or whatever. And he said, they make for very bad overlords, but they make for very good servants. Which was again a kind of, needling of colonial ego. Others, another Raja was sent, rather, again, horrible news, not to his liking. But the Raja did not want his people to know that his authority had been thwarted by the British. So he, although the notice received is bad, he organizes great celebrations, music, dancing, festival all around this, giving the impression that he had got exactly what he wanted, so that his subjects would not realize that he had actually been insulted. The Rajas fought with the British on small things. So a British resident would come and say that, why is my chair on the left side? It should be on the right side, because left side, motion side, right hand shoulder, status order. And the Rajas will resist. They will say, no, you've always been on the left, you stay there. And negotiations could go on for years and years and years simply to move the position of the chair. It may look to us sometimes that it's just about a chair, how frivolous and so on, but it's not. It's actually about a political principle and political projection. If the Raja, without a fight, gives in to the demand of the British resident, his own people will say that you have no authority, we don't respect you, we will just go up to the British every time we are unhappy with you. So for their own survival, for their own self-respect, they often had to stand up to the British. So I'm not saying that they were wonderful people who stood up out of, some patriotic principle, but out of the contemporary system that was there to preserve their political power, they had no option but to resist, even though the British were more powerful. Even in an unequal relationship, there were ways in which they could resist the British Raj. And those ways are interesting. If we talk about colonialism, nationalism and so on, it's interesting to study these forms of resisting imperialism as well.
And it was interesting to know that the second chapter is titled The Brahmin Who Knew English. Weren't you also engaging with the cultural politics of English as a language? Because as we read, we find that all the divans who were employed by the British as to guide the princes or whoever was in charge, they were actually chosen because of the power of their language and the kind of training that they received from the British. So would you like to comment about that?
Yeah, that's the other thing. English was a very powerful passport to political positions in the 19th century. Those able to wield that language naturally had a better shot at gaining important positions, even in the British bureaucracy. And what's interesting is that the large number of them were Brahmins. And this is, if you speak to scholars even today, they do say that there is a Brahmin dominance in public services in India to this day. In other fields also, it's just compared to their proportion of the population, Brahmins have an oversized influence simply because they had access to education and the right kind of education early on, which meant that they could take over. So in the book, in one of the notes I forget where it is, but it talks about how of the number of students graduating from Madras University in a certain year, I think it was 1,200 odd, some 800 or 900 of were Brahmins, and only the rest was all the other castes combined. So what's interesting is that this was another interesting facet in which princely politics worked, because often in a princely state you would have the British, you would have the Raja, and you would have the Divan, and politics was this kind of triangular contest between the three. Each could counter-manipulate the other at any given moment. So the Divans were important to the Rajas because as Brahmins, they were orthodox Hindu rulers. Brahmins were welcome because, easier in some ways to deal with Brahmins given your own caste taboos. At the same time, because these Brahmins also knew English, they were also good, efficient middlemen with the British. For the Divans, however, they also thought of a future where the princes would have constitutional government, where the princes would fade into the background as a kind of ceremonial head of state, and real power would be in the hands of the Divans, which often to a great measure happened here in Cochin state, where as time passed, the Rajas had less and less influence, and the Divans were increasingly dominant. In the 1860s, there was a Raja who wrote to his Divan saying, "In dono sir, ceremonies of Jayana, the paisa, he kalpichu. And Divan said, no, I'm not going to pay for this. This is state funds. You have to find money from your private resources. So the Divans had that kind of influence to even stand up to the Raja. So, and that's the thing, right? When we say princely states were under the British, we forget that there was British ruled India where the British were governing. This is also Indian ruled India. When we call them princely states, it's Indians ruling with Indian Divans, with Indian bureaucrats over Indian people. So even under colonialism, there were whole segments of India where Indians were still in charge. And these cases, that's another reason why the early nationalists respected the princely states. Because every time the British told them that brown people, you can't govern, natives can't rule themselves, that's why we British have to come and help you. The nationalists would point to the princely states and say, look at those states, good efficient demands, good governments, modern governance is taking place without any British interference, which clearly disproves the idea that natives can't govern. Sardar K.M. Panikkar calls the Divans and all of them a school of statesmen who ended up, contributing to the nationalist debate. The institutions that they set up, often they had budgets because the princely states did not have to spend on defense. That extra money went into education, healthcare, such other areas. So they were able to, through good governance, prove to the British that we don't need imperial guidance to rule. And that was also seen as a very powerful point. So something as simple as good governance was also in a sense a subversive act. It was a way in which you could remind the empire that your locus standi for being in India, which is to civilize India, doesn't exist. We can do it ourselves. We don't need it. But the relationship could get complicated, which is why some Rajas like the Maharaja of Udaipur would not appoint Divans, because he was always afraid that if he gets an English-speaking Brahmin Divan, the Brahmin Divan and the English language would mean that they and the British would become friends and curtail the Raja's power. So he would rule only through secretaries, and then he would divide and rule his secretaries. Whereas others had touchy relationships with their Divans. The relationships often soured very quickly.
And what about the women, who actually played a very important role in governing the princely states? And while reading, I thought that they were also very strategic planners. So would you like to, because there was a kind of a presence that was being felt when it came to the machinations of the state administration and strategic plans that they were mapping out for their people who are going to be the next in power. Yeah. So would you like to comment on Jamnabai? And there were so many women who come into the picture, very strong presence. And you never learn about them, you never read about them in history, but very interesting anecdotes about very different women, not the ideological, not the kind of women that we are attuned to, but different kind of people who really wielded power, who knew the art of strategic planning. Would you like to comment?
That's the thing. The British often, so the word harem, which is where most royal families are patriarchal, the harem was where the women of the palace would be. And the British always put the harem or blanketed it under the stereotype that the harem is either a place where the women are being oppressed, they're all lounging about sad and lonely because the Raja is not paying them attention, or they're sinister spaces where with their, in quotes, eunuchs, these women are intriguing and plotting and doing all kinds of nasty things. But it's interesting that so every time you come across a stereotype, as anybody who actually works with history knows, you must interrogate the stereotype. You must ask, why does this stereotype exist? What is it trying to communicate? What is it trying to potentially conceal? And the harem was a space of politics which the British could not access, because that was the one part of the palace that the British could not go into. They could go into the darbar, they've gone into temples, they could go into all kinds of places, but they were not allowed in the women's quarters. And therefore, women in the palace used that as a means to try and manipulate the British, and therefore the British ended up defaming the harem, saying that the harem is a bad place. Now, how did women do this? We assume that of course, it was not a fair word. The women, it was loaded against them. Even so, despite the fact that the odds were against them, women always managed to somehow or the other not only access power, but also thwart a lot of patriarchal institutions. In the royal case, we think that all these women were in Parda, right? Not really true. Jamnabai is officially in Parda, but when the Prince of Wales comes, she's happily around, she goes out riding. It's very strategically used. In Rajputana, there's a queen mother. She has when the old Raja dies and her little boy is the next ruler, there's a regency under her. And the queen mother says that she meets all her ministers, she meets all her favorite noblemen, she has no issues with that. When the British resident says, I want to come and meet you, she says, oh no, parda, parda. I will not see. Parda becomes an excuse to keep the British out and to determine political decisions in the harem with the other men and then send them out with the order. So the British have no avenue to even enter and try and influence the decision that is being taken. Often, these royal women could also manipulate not only the British but their own men. So Jamnabai, who you mentioned, is a fascinating character. Grew up in a village in Maharashtra called Rahimatpur. At the age of 13, she becomes wife to a man who's nearly 40 years old because he's married several times, doesn't have sons. For some reason, these Rajas always ran out of heirs, all these families. Except Cochin. Cochin has had a lot of heirs, far too many actually. But many of the Rajas did not have heirs. They could not father sons, so they would collect wives and then hope that one of them would give a son. Now, when she's about 17 years old, Jamnabai's husband dies. And two options are there. Either the British have to enthrone the brother-in-law, who's the previous Raja's brother, or Jamnabai should have had a son. Now what's interesting is the British, noting this in several states, say that often in princely states when Rajas die without heirs, suddenly their widows become pregnant. It's just sudden. Nobody knows how, but it happens. All this time there's no pregnancy, suddenly there's a pregnancy. Which, it seems funny in a sense, but it's also interesting that when women are contained and restrained to that feminine, body alone, they still manage to access politics through that. They can turn that on its head and still find a way to gain authority and influence. What they do is by declaring a pregnancy, till the child is born, because if it's a male child it can succeed, the succession can't be decided. What does that mean? It means the pieces on the political chessboard can now move about, new alliances can be formed, the women of the harem have a say, a potential say in determining what the future could be. It creates a few months of an interim over there. Now what's interesting is Jamnabai does this. Her brother-in-law is fretting and fuming and angry. He tries to poison her. He sends her a basket of wood apples and she discovers it's injected with something very mysterious, so she doesn't have it. She starts sleeping with a dog tied to her bed. She starts cooking her own food. Ultimately, she moves into the British resident's house to deliver the baby there. Now the Raja is also clever. He comes there and he waits outside the door while she's giving birth because he doesn't want the baby to be replaced. So ultimately, she gives birth to a girl called Tarabai. Raja wins. He goes around Baroda throwing gold coins in the air because he's finally the king. Jamnabai does not just disappear. She does not say, okay, I tried, I failed, now I should have just retreated to the harem and disappear forever. She doesn't. With the jewelry that her late husband had left her, she goes off to Pune. Pune is in British India. Pune is where all the nationalist Maharashtrian press is. This is where all the big politicians of the day are. She starts lobbying these people. She starts selling her jewelry, and with the money that she raises, she pays people in Baroda to complain against the Maharaja, her brother-in-law, who she doesn't like. So she's getting people to keep up a constant barrage of complaints against the Maharaja, and the British are watching. They think that the people don't like the Maharaja, therefore they're complaining against the Maharaja. In reality, he was slightly nasty, but even so, much of these complaints were sponsored by Jamnabai. All the same, she's manipulating the British also. There's a British resident who doesn't like the Raja. So she decides that I must put a kind of wedge between them. She starts bribing the British resident servants as well. So they would fan his animosity against the Raja. So this one woman sitting in Pune gets the people of Baroda to stand up to the Raja. She gets the residents officials manipulated against him, and ultimately the Raja is toppled. She gets to come back now triumphantly. And she and the British both determine that the next person who has a claim to authority is about 30 years old. Venda, too old, aarkum control Venda, so he's exiled to Banaras. And instead they sit down and find a 12-year-old boy who's working on a farm, illiterate boy, very, very distant relative. They install him on the throne. And the British from their side are bombarding him with lectures so that he's a submissive prince. She's trying to control him from her side so that, she can be the power behind the throne. Ultimately, after 6 years of ostensible training, he becomes the Raja. As it happens, he doesn't listen to either of them. So Jamnabai is quite annoyed. And again, she tries to conspire with the British. And that's the final bit of the story where she, in 1883, writes to Calcutta saying that so far his self-sufficiency means he's not been listening to you and he's not been listening to me either. So let's get rid of him. I shall become the supreme authority in Baroda. This time, however, the British did not play ball with her. And they just gave her a large allowance and said, you go your way now. The boy is here to rule for good. And he ended up ruling for decades and decades till 1939. But that one story tells you the different ways in which a woman supposedly in Partha, supposedly with the world, stacked against her, still manages not only to access influence, even if briefly for a few years, But in those critical years, not only did she topple one Maharaja, she created a new Maharaja, only failed in controlling him ultimately. But she managed, pulled off a huge political feat, something very Machiavellian in some respects. And she was a 17-year-old girl who came out of Rahimatpur, which not of royal background herself. That's the other thing about many of these royals. So many of them were adopted from relatively obscure positions, that the idea that somehow the generations or even a privileged position, the institution is of privilege, but the people who come into it were often adopted from outside. They were, pretty ordinary kids who were picked up and put on the throne.
And I think especially the King of Baroda, he was a visionary, I think. And there is, as a reader, I was fascinated to know that B.R. Ambedkar was one of his, he
sponsored his education.
And he was the one who funded the education of B.R. Ambedkar, who drafted our constitution. So these are, I think, Manu, you have given us so many stories. It is not history, but there are so many stories. And one last thing that I wanted to share with the audience, I think Manu will be speaking about the colors. It was very interesting to note that the thieves, I think there was something very interesting about the colors of Pudukkottai. I've been to that place, it has got a very different kind of culture. And the colors were recognized, they were thieves actually. And then they openly said, stealing is our business, you Brahmins chant Vedas and we colors steal. And Sheshaya Rao, who was the Diwan at that time, I think Manu will tell us how he integrated the colors into the mainstream of, made them totally different and they became protectors of the state.
It was a very complicated thing. That's the other thing that's happening in the princely states. It tells you so much about culture, caste, and how caste identities can even change. Because the colors are basically what in Malayalam we call Kalai. That kind of thing. And same essential, a word, the meaning of the word is the same. And they were called a robber caste. The British, in fact, as a caste, called them a criminal tribe, that they were genetically prone to criminal activities. In Pudukkottai, they were royalty. Now, as royalty, naturally meant they were not robbing anybody. They had a state, so they were quite well off. But what happens in the 19th century is that the idea of modern progress not only means building roads, canals, institutions. For a lot of nationalists and native statesmen from M.G. Ranade, Dadabhai Naoroji and others, they also want to reshape the idea of the king itself. Nobody wants to abolish the states. They don't want to abolish kings. They think kings represent a continuity with the past. They're part of India's heritage. So they need to be reformed. They need to be made, adapt to the modern age, for which these Brahmin bureaucrats would help. But what's interesting is Sheshaya Shastri goes in there very much like a school headmaster and says, colors, we're going to get rid of all your bad qualities and I will tell you what all your good qualities are. Again, what's interesting is that the big challenge to him comes from the women of the palace. Because he says, the women of the palace are surrounded by devdasis, dancing girls, very bad influence. The women of the palace counter saying, you're seeing only dancing girls. What we are saying is different. These are dancing girls who dance in the temples, they dance in the houses of important men, in the houses of politicians. They hear what's happening in the world. They are an intelligence network that come and tell us what is happening outside the palace. The dancing girls were a way in which the women of the palace understood what was happening in the kingdom. So by cutting them off, calling them dancing girls as if that's a bad thing, Sheshaya Shastri was actually clipping their political wings. He was turning them into women who were just stuck in the palace in some kind of a domestic sphere and sort of emasculating them in terms of their political power. Similarly, he tells he was earlier Diwan in Travancore, but Travancore they have this concept of Padmanabha Dasan. And as a good Brahmin, Sheshaya Shastri says, I will now introduce this to the colors also. And he starts to get them to declare themselves Shri Brihadamba Dasas. And they are taken aback because they worship Brihadamba, but it doesn't mean Antra is Sanskritized culture. So he pushes Sanskritization. So every time we say that in the 19th century there were lots of reformers, we often forget that reform was not just material progress, it was not just material events, but also involved a lot of communal social engineering, which meant what scholars and sociologists call Sanskritization. Telling some people that your culture is bad, therefore we will tell you good culture. It's a form of colonial thinking in its own right, which is saying that one class of Indians is better than others, your culture is bad, you must transform your culture. Of course, Sheshaya Shastri's plan backfires spectacularly. He and the British train up the young Maharaja of Pudukkottai to be this perfect prince who speaks English and is a Brihadamba Das and all of that. Guy decides, you know, I'm so reformed that I cannot even marry a colored woman, I will marry only a white woman. Goes to Australia, marries a lady called Molly Fink, abandons his kingdom and moves on. So much for the British and this demand trying to reform somebody, the reformation ended up completely backfiring. And ultimately the British themselves learned that we don't need to decolorize the colors that much. Let them have their culture, let them have their space. Then you have a king who actually recognizes his people and connects with them. If you cut off all these cultural links and synthetically try to improve somebody, how does that work? So in princely states there's also dynamics like this happening which can tell us a lot about caste relations to this day, about how what we decide is superior culture or high culture and what is low culture. You know, which gods we worship and which we've forgotten. You know, go to any old town in Kerala and you will see that there are gods that have been forgotten. Gods that we don't worship anymore because we now think that the blood sacrifices are bad or pujas with alcohol are bad. So everything is now, instead of alcohol, now you do palabhisheka. But that's also a historical process, right? You're transforming an earlier god into something else. All of these are interesting dynamics and I think it's important for us to study this in history.
So now, I think the questions from my side would never end. I leave the floor open for a few questions from the audience.
എനിക്കൊരു ചോദ്യം ചോദിക്കാനുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. കാലത്തെ ഓട്ടിസ് ഹിസ്റ്ററി വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടോ? ഓക്കെ അതിൽ റിലേറ്റഡ് ആയിട്ട് ചോദിക്കാനായിരുന്നു. ഇപ്പം നമ്മുടെ ഹിസ്റ്ററി എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് ഡീലിംഗ് വിത്ത് ഫാക്ട്സ്, കുറെ സയന്റിഫിക് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു സംഭവമാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഇപ്പം ഈ ഫാക്ട് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾ ഇവിടെ സ്കൂട്ടർ വെച്ചിട്ടുള്ള നമ്മുടെ ഒരു ഫാക്റ്റാണ്, ബാറ്റൻസും ഫാക്റ്റാണ്. അപ്പം ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻസ് പറയുന്നുണ്ട് ഇപ്പം ഇതായിരുന്നു ഗ്രേറ്റസ്റ്റ് വാർ ഓഫ് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ അത് ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻ പറയുമ്പോഴാണ് നമുക്കത് ഗ്രേറ്റസ്റ്റ് വാർ ഓഫ് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻസ് ആവുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഓർഡറിങ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്ട്രക്ചറിങ് ഓഫ് ഇവന്റ്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻ്റെ ബിസിനസ് ആണല്ലോ. അപ്പോൾ ഈ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ഉണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോൾ പോൾ സെലീസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ബുക്ക് വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് നമുക്ക് കുറേ കൂടി മനസ്സിലാവുന്നുണ്ട് പ്രിൻസ്ലി സ്റ്റേറ്റ്സ് അവരുടെ കാര്യങ്ങൾ 40% ഹിസ്റ്ററിയുടെ സംഭവങ്ങൾ അതൊക്കെ മനസ്സിലാവുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോൾ സിനിമയിൽ നമ്മൾ ഓറൽ ഹിസ്റ്ററി ഒരുപാട് പരീക്ഷിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയിലേക്ക് വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് ഓറൽ ഹിസ്റ്ററിയുടെ ഒരുപാട് ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസസ് ആണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ മനുവിനോട് ചോദിക്കാനുള്ള കാര്യം, as a historian you are also a human being, right? How do you find purpose of life while you are writing history? What is your process? The existential ആയിട്ടുള്ള questions എന്തായാലും വരുമല്ലോ. It's not like what is life, പക്ഷേ ഒരുപാട് events ആകുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് life is confusing in a way. So how do you find it?
It's true because annathe pole innathe pole okay, life is always complex. So you know, history is always an argument that you construct and Mike chattath bilkao. History is always an argument you construct. It's always a debate and a conversation that's going forward. Each generation makes certain contributions. It may get outdated by the next generation. Pudhiya facts varam, pudhiya details varam, an old argument may not stand up. In greatest war of independence. I belong to a generation of students of history who don't use words like greatest. We don't use terms like that. And the adjectives in it because we realize that you can never categorically say that about anything. It was one of the processes that happened then. That is it. But if you're asking me about my purpose in life and that kind of existential thing, no, look, I study history. That's my job. It's what I enjoy doing. These are the kinds of stories I want to tell, and that energizes me to that extent. I don't think there's anything more existential that I've really sat and pondered about. It is my mission, if you will, but I don't romanticize it. I see it as work. I see it as something I want to do, and I see it as something I want to contribute to. At the end of my life, hopefully there will be a shelf in which at least I have 10 titles, and out of the 10, if I can be proud of 5, then maybe I feel like something has been achieved and things were not completely worthless. But beyond that, I don't sit and romanticize it or think of myself sitting and achieving some kind of grand mission in life. That's the sort of attitude I take. Oral history is very important. That's acknowledged by everybody. Because any subject you don't only refer to written records, you refer to all kinds of records. Architectural history, oral history, material evidence, objects, and the records that are there. Sometimes simply by visiting places you can figure things out that earlier people may have missed. Oral history neglect here. Oral history, negotiating that requires a kind of expertise. Should I take up a controversial subject? In response to my first book called The Ivory Throne, what I first got was a defamation notice, to which I wrote back an answer. The defamation notice went away. But then one of the members of the royal family in Trivandrum, they wrote a book in which it's a collection of oral history. And it has value in the sense that that memory as a family of what happened, it is an interesting source for that. So for me in future, if I ever write on Travancore, I will refer to that as a source that represents what they remember of that period. But it doesn't mean it's accurate, it's an accurate memory, So when you say there were 3 Vadashramams against Chitradirmal that were there. So my immediate question is, look in the book, what is the source for that claim? Ammuma Barney. For me, I'm going to say a problem. But not because of anything else. What I'm saying is, I then place it against the rest of the context. In that period, at that time, marital dispute, so somehow, detailed, somehow nobody recorded. Very, very strange, isn't it? So you have to apply your mind, take oral history, compare it to the other sources that you have, then reach a certain kind of conclusion. So my conclusion is, Vadashraman does not seem to have happened, but that story has been created for some purpose. The next question then is, why does that story circulate? Why is it that the Vadashramam itself is this very Mahabharata style Vadashramam, where Maharaj is going in a chariot and the wheel comes loose or something? 1920s, poison, sophisticated poison. This is such an obvious way of killing somebody. So having a Mahabharata style of trying to kill the king, telling that story, is a part of projecting him as some kind of victim constantly who had to fight enemies and sort of rise and shine as a phoenix. That is the intent of that oral narrative in that particular context. Marthandavarma of Travancore. Official narrative on the official history, great king. But then there's also counter narrative, which is oral history from his time that has survived in the Thambimar Kadai, which is a Villapata sung in Nanjanad by certain communities. There's this one instance where he's fighting with his cousins. He compromise effectively, he makes him prarthike and says, I will not fight with my cousins. And Marthandavarma says it. But Thambimar Kadai is life So the Marthandavarma that comes across in that oral narrative is a complete anti-hero. He's not even the anti-hero, he's the full villain of that story. Again, you don't take the oral narrative fully as if it's gospel truth. You take that, you compare it with the official narrative, you compare it with the physical record that's been left, you look at the temple chronicles that exist, you have something that you can reach some kind of a conclusion on. So oral history is extremely valuable. But the question is, how do we negotiate oral history? And how do we understand how to separate fact from fiction, or understanding why that oral history has come up in that particular way?
I think we can take one more question. Short question, please.
No, we can take more. I'll just shorten my answers. I don't know.
I'm a PhD research scholar in history. So something I would like to ask is, though history as an academic subject is seen as something, especially in India, we have a trend that you tend to sleep while you study history. And others ask you, if I say that I'm a PhD research scholar, people tend to ask, do you want to enjoy your life? Are you not interested in getting a job? That's the kind of question I always face. But when you come to popular literature or movies, people love to ask or read them, see them. And if you have a question like, if I say there are some factual errors in the movie like Parshi Raja, they tend to tell you, MT can't be wrong, Harijan can't be wrong. They know much more history than the people who are academically in history. But the saddest thing I've read recently in a so-called popular kind of history is that one guy had written, you tend to name dogs, your dogs in your house as Tipu because you tend to have a generational hatred for Tipu Sultan, and that was one of the bizarre things I ever read. So those kinds of things, it has more or less become something that runs up everybody can intervene in history, runs up everybody can write in history, whether it's your family history, read R. Sharma or any other popular historians. How do you see this trend?
See, it's not a trend as such. The thing is, it's more or less always been the case. There's a kind of collective memory, there's a kind of, so much gossip circulates. Historically, so much gossip has circulated. Half of historical resource material is essentially written down gossip. That's, if you go to archives, colonial archives sounds very grand, but what is the viceroy getting every 2 months? In Kottayathile, Rani, 3 manikku edo oru Germany കാണാൻ പോയി. Which is, again, it's an accumulation of hearsay of what's happened, etc. Again, there are ways to sift through that. But the important thing is that is, see, you have to pick the battles that you're going to fight. This is how it is. Technology is there, WhatsApp is there, a lot of rubbish is going to be peddled and it's going to go around. The important thing is to not get aggravated by it all the time and to think that somehow we're drowning in this age of misinformation. The important thing is to try and make good research more accessible, to try and sort of put out your version in an interesting way without compromising on research, to try and woo people so that, if not out of 10 people, even if one person comes over and says, okay, fine, I'll read the book rather than believe what comes on WhatsApp, that's already a victory as far as the discipline goes. I think, that's how you fight this battle. You don't get overwhelmed by the rubbish that you hear. You keep doing what you're doing, try and be good at what you do, and that's it. Eventually, WhatsApp forward has a limited shelf life, but a book sits on a shelf for very many years. So at some point or the other, when somebody really wants to get serious, they know that they're not going to pick up their phone and WhatsApp. They'll end up going and picking up a book if they ever get to that point of seriousness. Manu, long answer, I could.
Hello, this is Maitri, I'm a lawyer. So I have 2 questions. One is that everyone has their own prejudices, and as far as I understand, or many of us understand, history is about truth. So how far you go behind truth? And the second one is, how do you overcome your own prejudices, or is there a situation where you had to overcome your prejudice to see the truth?
So the thing is, there are some objective truths, such as we breathe, oxygen. That is an objective truth. The more slender your material becomes, it is also a process of interpreting that material. Often, Harappa civilization, we haven't even deciphered the script, if it is a script at all. We're not even sure if it is a script. It's communicating something, we don't know what it is. So we are trying to interpret that. We are trying to connect dots that we still don't fully understand. Which means there's always going to be room for error. There's always going to be room for mistakes to be made. There's always going to be revisions as time passes. Which historians know, which is that, nobody claims that they have a monopoly on an objective truth. None of my books makes the argument that this is the definitive work on this, nothing can surpass this. That's a very immodest, arrogant thing to say. In reality, based on the evidence available now, this is a reasonable argument that has been made. In future, more material may come to light and the argument may be revised. That is how history always goes forward. And this is why, when people say, historians are liars, or, Romela Thapar, some great conspiracy to teach us bad history. Not true. It's just, you don't know how to look at historical material. She does. And opinions change over time. They evolve with time. More material changes. The way the landscape itself is. A lot of that comes into play. I don't think I'm completely objective. It's not possible. As a human being, you're a creature of privilege, you're a creature of your background, you're a creature of the languages you speak, you're a creature of where you were born, in whose house you were born, all of those elements. But when you're doing your research and making an argument and writing it, there are ways in which it can be minimized. Your subjectivity can be minimized to say 5%, and you try consciously to be as objective as possible. You let the material lead you. You don't pick and choose from the material to sort of retrofit into an already made argument, into an already preset impression. You revise your opinion if the material suggests that, even if it's unpleasant, even if it makes you look like a fool in another respect. So that sort of honesty is where I think the answer lies.
I think the great Cambridge historian Maitland reminds us what you now said. That is, he always used to say that history reminds us what is now in the past was once in the future. So this is actually a maxim for all historians, and that is what he used to teach his students. So that happens all the time. So any more questions from the audience?
Hello. ഞാൻ ആക്ച്വലി പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ കണ്ടന്റിനേക്കാൾ കൂടുതൽ താങ്കളുടെ എഴുത്തിൻ്റെ രീതി അതിനെ കുറിച്ച് ചോദിക്കാനായിരുന്നു. പല എഴുത്തുകാരും പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ വായിക്കുന്നതിനൊപ്പം നമുക്ക് ഇഷ്ടമുള്ള എഴുത്തുകാരുടെ എഴുത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രോസസ്സ് അറിയാൻ പറ്റുന്നിടത്ത് നോക്കാറുണ്ട്, അതിനുള്ള താല്പര്യമുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ ചില എഴുത്തുകാരത് വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്, അവർ എഴുതിയത് തിരുത്താറില്ല, ഒരു ഫ്ലോലങ്ങ് പോലെ, എസ്പെഷ്യലി ഫിക്ഷൻ. ഫസ്റ്റ് കണ്ടനാണ് ബെസ്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞത്. റീസെൻ്റ്ലി GR ഇന്ദുഗോപൻ്റെ ആമുഖത്തിൽ വായിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അത് ഫുള്ള് വായിച്ചപ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് ഫീൽ ചെയ്തത് ഒരു ഫിലിമൊക്കെ എടുക്കുന്ന പ്രോസസ്സ് പോലെയാണ് ആ പുസ്തകം എഴുതി വരുന്നത്. മേ ബി അതുകൊണ്ടായിരിക്കണം ആ പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ സൈസും വളരെ ആറ്റിക്കുറുക്കിയ ഒരു വർത്തകൾ. അപ്പം എനിക്ക് അറിയാൻ താല്പര്യമുള്ളതെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ താങ്കളുടെ പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്ന പ്രോസസ്സ് ഉണ്ടാവും, എഴുത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രോസസ്, റിസർച്ചിൻ്റെ പ്രോസസ്സ് അല്ല, എഴുത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രോസസ്സിൽ താങ്കൾ എന്തെങ്കിലും മേ ബി അഡ്വൈസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എന്താ പ്രോസസ്സ് ക്യൂരിയസ്?
അഡ്വൈസ് ആയിട്ടില്ല, പക്ഷെ എനിക്ക് ഒരുപാട് ഡേറ്റ ആദ്യം അരച്ച് മനസ്സിലാക്കി ഡൈജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തതിന് ശേഷം എഴുതാൻ പറ്റത്തുള്ളൂ. അപ്പം ആദ്യം ഒരുപാട് വായിക്കണം, വായിച്ച് നോട്ട്സ് ഉണ്ടാക്കണം. അപ്പം ഇതിന് തന്നെ 550 പേജാണ് പ്രിന്റ്, ഇതിനൊരു 5000 പേജിന്റെ നോട്ട്സ് കാണുന്നുണ്ട്. വേർഡ് ഡോക്യുമെന്റ്സ് എല്ലാം കൗണ്ട് ചെയ്ത് ഒരുപാട് നോട്ട്സ് കാണും. എല്ലാം ഒന്നും ഇതിനകത്ത് പോകത്തില്ല. പക്ഷെ അത് മൊത്തം വായിച്ചാലേ നമുക്ക് ഒരു ബ്രോഡ് കോൺഫിഡൻസ് വരത്തുള്ളൂ, ഈ സബ്ജക്റ്റിനെ നമുക്ക് ടാക്കിൾ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുമോ ഇല്ലയോ. പിന്നെ ദി ആക്ച്വൽ എഴുത്ത്, അത് യൂഷ്വലി ഒരു ഫസ്റ്റ് ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് കാണും. എൻ്റെ ഫസ്റ്റ് ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് ഒന്നും കൊടുത്തില്ല, അത് ആർക്കും വായിക്കാനും കൊടുക്കത്തില്ല, കാരണം അത് വളരെ വൃത്തികെട്ട ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ്സ് ആണ്. പക്ഷെ അതിനുശേഷം, ബിക്കോസ് ദ ഫസ്റ്റ് ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് ഫോർ മീ ഈസ് ആർഗ്യുമെന്റ് ഫ്രെയിം ചെയ്യുന്ന ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് ആണ്. ബേസിക് മെറ്റീരിയൽ, നമ്മുടെ എവിഡൻസ്, ഫുട് നോട്ട്സ് ഒക്കെ വെച്ച് നമ്മുടെ ആർഗ്യുമെന്റ്, ഒരു സ്കെലിറ്റൽ സ്ട്രക്ചർ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന അതാണ് ഫസ്റ്റ് ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ്. പിന്നാണ് ലാംഗ്വേജിൽ ഫോക്കസ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് ഈ പറയുന്ന ആർഗ്യുമെന്റിന് ഇച്ചിലൂടെ ഇൻട്രസ്റ്റിംഗ് എങ്ങനെ ആക്കും, ഇച്ചിലൂടെ അതിന് ഫ്ലേവറും ടെക്സ്ചറും കളറും ഒക്കെ നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെ കൊണ്ടുവരും, അത് രണ്ടാമത്തെ സ്റ്റേജിലാണ് അത് നടക്കുന്നത്. ആദ്യത്തെ പുസ്തകത്തിന് ചില ഭാഗങ്ങൾ 5 ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ട്, ചില ഭാഗങ്ങൾ 4 ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ട്, ചില ഭാഗം 1 ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റേ കാണത്തുള്ളൂ. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരേ പുസ്തകത്തിൽ പല പല രീതികളിലായിരിക്കും ഓരോ ഭാഗവും എഴുതിയിരിക്കുന്നത്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പക്ഷെ പൊതുവെ ഐ യൂഷ്വലി ഹാവ് ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ്സ്, ഐ യൂഷ്വലി വർക്ക് ത്രൂ മൾട്ടിപ്പിൾ ഡ്രാഫ്റ്റ്സ്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് സമയം എടുക്കുന്നത്. ഞാൻ ഒരിക്കലും എഴുത്തിനെ റൊമാൻറ്റിസൈസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടില്ല, ബിക്കോസ് ഇത് മുമ്പ് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്, some of you may have heard me say this, it's not like we sit in the morning and art flows into our brains and it emerges from our fingers in some wonderful divine gift. There are no divine gifts, you know. It's ആശാരിമാരെ കണ്ടുകൊണ്ടോ ജോലി ചെയ്യുന്നത്, ഇരുന്ന് എന്നും ആ സോ വെച്ച് ഇത് വർക്ക് ചെയ്തിട്ട് അവസാനമായിരിക്കും ഒരു ഭംഗിയുള്ള സാധനം ഉണ്ടായി വരുന്നത്. അതേപോലെയാണ് ഒരു ആശാരിയെ പോലെ ഇരുന്ന് കുറെ നാള് കണ്ട ഇത് എന്തോ ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നത് പോലും മനസ്സിലാവില്ല. അവസാനം പക്ഷെ സം ക്ലാരിറ്റി, സം ഷേപ്പ്, സം ബ്യൂട്ടി സ്റ്റാർട്സ് കമ്മിങ് ഇൻടു ഇറ്റ്. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു പുസ്തകം വരുന്നത്. ലൈക്ക് any other profession, practice makes you better.
Hi Manu. So trick question, and I'm sure every one of them sitting here will have the same question.
No. What question is this?
So from day one, when I started seeing your interviews, how do you retain so much of information in your head?
Nice question. No, because after the age of 30, there's another question that people keep asking. It's rather annoying. But anyway, I retain information. I don't know. It's just, this is my job, right? Like, this is what I do. I read, I write. I read, I write. This is what I do. And the more you do that, you're essentially constantly doing homework. You're constantly remembering things. You're constantly in your head thinking about those things. Nothing is read in, for work I don't read for leisure, right? It's reading for work, which means your brain is already attuned to the fact that I am going to retain this because I need this information to write an essay, construct an argument, whatever it is. So that's the only reason it comes to me. But the other thing is, I suppose, because I think of the past through these interesting stories, it makes it easier to remember. There's a reason why in India, where the climate was against maintaining records would dravicify very quickly. The general culture therefore was one of orality, oral history. Even the Vedas are what originally? They were oral. They were not written down texts. They were passed down, orally. So that oral culture is necessarily why we have the Puranic tradition, which is to communicate something of historical importance through stories. Because human beings may not remember dry facts, but they will remember stories. So you weave the same things into stories. Why is history, why are my books selling? For the simple reason that you don't just communicate the facts of history, you also build a narrative around it that people find interesting and engaging. Because it's always the case. You condense something into a story form, it works better, it's more memorable. Even in my own head, I can remember it because I remember it as stories. I began taking an interest in history because of the stories I heard from my grandmother. And they were not mutashikadas. They were rather entertaining stories about my ancestors and their various naughty things. But it was interesting. It was just so fascinating to hear that you end up retaining it. So it's just a skill you pick up with practice. That's all.
My name is Unikrishnan. I'm I'm a law student. I'm asking out of curiosity from a sort of law student. As a man who's gone through so much of history, who's seen the rise and fall of kingdoms and kings, what do you think of the current political situation of this country?
That would probably take very many hours to discuss in any detail. But it's not a good political climate. It is a rather tense political climate. There's lots of unfortunate things happening. There's lots of unfortunate institutional degradation that is happening, which does not bode well for the future, as it were. It does not bode well for the structure of the country even. But I'm not a pessimist in the sense that India's diversity is such that ultimately I don't think anything can pin down such a large country of so many people with so many backgrounds and cultures and religions under one blanket kind of thing. Somebody may try, but it's not possible for that to last. So I remain an optimist because I think it's going to be a painful few years, it's going to be a painful phase, but there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and the tunnel is not going to be all that long as we sometimes think it might. History tells you about patterns in the past, and patterns in the past essentially suggest that anybody who overstretches in India ends up crumbling and destroying his own influence and power. And therefore, any political dispensation or ideology that tries to overstretch, that tries too hard to press something down, inevitably will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. It won't be easy, but I'm quite convinced it will happen. So I don't see things entirely from a pessimistic light. The present is depressing, but the future I think will find its own course correction. It will leave us altered, it will leave us changed. We may need leaders who are able to again inspire people and do something and all of that. But I have a feeling it will happen. It's inevitable. It will happen.
So, my name is Hari and I'm a law student. And in Ivory Throne, we find mention of the Irava community getting a considerable political consideration in the tribe, despite being a member of, or despite being a community of the lower ranks of the caste hierarchy. So, as a historian, can you give us more examples of kingdoms where the lower caste got a political say of their own?
I wouldn't use the phrase lower there. What's interesting is there are communities that are brought into the power structure, and then there are communities outside the power structure. With the Iravas, the community was outside the power structure. And what is interesting is that in the 19th century, with the coming of the census in British India, and it was copied in the princely states, suddenly they realized that we are a large number of people. If you count all the Iravas in Travancore, it's a huge number, almost as big as the Nairs, which meant it gives the community a sense of solidarity. Then they realized, hold on, if we're such a big community, we're such a big chunk of the state, why aren't we being treated with the respect we deserve? Combine that with Sri Narayana Guru's moral kind of message, so there's a kind of moral elevation that's also happening. It's a combination of all these, and of course colonial economics. The Iravas also became financially better off in the late 19th century. It's the combination of that makes them influential, and ultimately the Rajas have to reluctantly, gratingly, against their will, give them a seat at the table, which is why temple entry also happens in 1936. It's not about temples, it's actually about making sure the Iravas do not leave the fold and they become stakeholders rather than opposed to the royal system. The effort didn't work. In fact, after temple entry, Sridhar Menon's book has this mysterious line from Chitrarana the Raja where he says, I don't want the Iravas in the Travancore army because I don't trust them. So it tells you that even the Raja did not see that the Iravas could be fully integrated into the power structure. Looked at that way, you see that in Mysore, where you see the Veerashaivas. The Veerashaivas begin as a community that resists caste. They stand up to caste, they resist temple worship, they bury their dead. They only believe in Shiva, which they wear as an Ishtalinga. They don't even go to temples. And they had a habit of periodically standing up to the Wadiyar government of the Mysore royals. Through the 18th century, in the 19th century, they remained that way. And you see that because in 1829-30 there was a rebellion of the Veerashaivas that actually ended up with the Raja being deposed. The British kicked the Raja out of power because he couldn't control the situation. What's interesting is that because of that, by the late 19th century, the Raja started making sure that they gave the Veerashaivas a seat at the table, made sure that they did not interfere in a way that the Veerashaivas would be upset. So similar dynamics over there. In Kerala, it was an upper caste, lower caste thing as well. With the Lingayats, it's not really a lower caste. It's a community that rejects caste in some ways ideologically. But it's again about power. Who's in the tent and who's kept outside the tent. And how much power does the person outside have to either pull down the tent completely or negotiate an entrance. Usually, kings, if they wanted to survive, would devise a means by which castes could be integrated. So one of the Nayakas of Tamil Nadu, there was, I think, Colors. They were giving him some trouble. So if I'm not wrong, the story goes that he orchestrated a marriage between their god and one of his gods, which was a way of bringing them into the system. And it worked for some time. It kept the peace, they were given their space, they were given their recognition, and that was that. In certain other places, if you don't recognize them, there'll be rebellion and you'll be booted out of power. So it's quite fascinating how this kind of thing works.
I think they became the system finally.
They did.
Yeah. They became the system finally, Kalas.
Hello Manu, great fan of your work, even greater fan of your Instagram stories. So my question is basically, there are two sides to the question. One is on the research process. With every book, the purview of the topic expands. Like here you're going, the multiple stages that you're covering. So could you tell us more about the research process, the kind of archives that you visited, and the possible Rashomon effect? You did explain that with the Mata story. But again, a Rashomon effect where you're probably in Maharashtra, you see one side of you read one side of the story, and then you go to Gujarat and you see this completely different narrative. The second part is there are royalties, there are political royalties, and there are royalties who became politicians. One of the quick names that really comes into my mind is Jyotiraj Scindia. Could you, if you have if you have recorded those instances where royalties have successfully transitioned into the independent India's political structure, could you comment on that?
I'll answer the second part first because it's a more easy answer in some ways, which is that one of the reasons many of them have succeeded even in democratic politics is because there is a kind of cultural resonance to the idea of the king even now. There's a fascinating study by Ian Copeland who talks about how communal violence back in the day was less in the princely states compared to British India. And I found that fascinating because a lot of these princely rulers were officially custodians of Hinduism and you would expect them to be ultra, like Orthodox Hindus or whatever. But in reality, communal violence was less. Anti-Muslim violence, for example. Simply because that paternalistic relationship with the people meant that before something bubbled into violence, they were able to come to some kind of compromise. The Raja would put his foot down and enable some kind of an arrangement. And I think that paternalistic link sometimes means that even descendants of royalty continue to be treated a certain way. I have a theory, for example, that if you ask someone in Kerala about the Travancore royal family, they will have heard of them. But you ask them who's the Maharaja of Cochin and nobody knows. And my theory is simple, which is that in 1947, or 49 rather, when the integration took place, the Cochin royal family gave up its control over the Sri Purna Teresa temple. Travancore kept the Padmanabha Swami temple. So the relevance of the royal family to this day, at least in Trivandrum, partly comes because the veneration felt to the temple sort of is reflected onto them as well. And because they lead temple rituals, they have that very visual presence in the city, it results in their constantly being alive in people's imagination. In North India, a lot of Rajas converted that into electoral success as well. These chaps obviously haven't. But in Cochin, by giving up your temple, and I remember a member of the family telling me that that gate from which the Raja used to enter was sealed permanently. By doing that, in some ways, you've cut yourself out of public imagination. You faded into the background because there's nothing to keep the idea of even the king as a cultural figure alive. So when sometimes I used to earlier laugh at these Rajputana royals because they still have coronation rites and in their hotels they still sort of walk about in these colourful clothes and almost as if they live in the previous century. But I realized that it's actually done for a purpose, to keep alive a certain kind of memory and to keep alive their relevance even in a changing world. And that is where the electoral politics thing comes. And now I don't remember the first part of the question. Oh no, research, yes. So I'll answer that quickly. The sources for this book, for example, archives in Delhi, some from the Kerala State Archives, the London British India Office Archives, some materials, free material from the Museum of Modern Conflict, the diaries of a royal tutor, some from the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, which was Lord Minto's private papers, Lord Curzon's private papers of some of these royals, parliamentary records in the House of Commons, because a lot of princely politics was discussed in the British Parliament as well. In India, of course, National Archives in Delhi, the records from that time, but also memoirs, biographies from that period. So Jamna Bai, a lot of people didn't know her details, but I found details on her in this old 120-year-old Marathi biography. And nobody knows who even the publisher is because it was created as some kind of basic print. But I found it and I read Marathi, therefore I was able to cull a lot of details from there. Newspaper sources, because newspapers were in a sense the social media of the day. So when Raja Ravivarma's father and got embroiled in a murder case, which strangely none of his biographies talk about, you find the entire record in newspapers because it was such a scandal, it was recorded. And there's a reason why his biographers never recorded it, because it was embarrassing material. So the newspapers there give you what the official biographies don't. So there's various sources like that. I've been to a bunch of these places, looked at the actual physical landscape and understood it. Then of course, scholarly studies on some of the broader themes. So when I talk of tribal resistance in Udaipur, I'm not a scholar of tribal resistance. So I have the archival record of episodes, but to make sense of those episodes, I would rely on, say, Hira Singh, some of the other scholars who worked specifically on that. So it's a combination of all that ultimately resulted in the book.
I think we will end the question answer session. We would have loved to take more questions, but I think time is our enemy. So I thank each one of you who came out with questions, and let me conclude this and thank you. I don't know how happy we are at St. Teresa's, and I think the fans in Kochi also are happy to have you with us after a long period of break. He knows his readers are not passive vessels to receive a text placed before him, her or other. He knows his readers are a civilized and critical citizens just as much as a historian is. With ideological and political preferences. The further we go back in time, the less a problem this is or more. We as potential readers share a right to look for truth about women and men in history. You are driven by a curiosity of the writer rather than certainty, motivated by a wish to understand the modern history of 1/6 of the humankind. I conclude, it is a breathtaking as well as reassuring account, as well as an analysis of the major princely states, the political movements, themes, and 3 complexes which I spoke about, and the processes that shaped our nation. However, the manner of storytelling has been driven by 2 fundamental ambitions: to pay proper respect to the social and political diversity of India, and to unravel the puzzle that has so long confronted all of us, academicians, scholars, foreigners and natives alike, namely, why is there an India at all? On this note, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the audience for listening and putting up with my very long answers. And I hope many of you will read the book, and I hope you like the book. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you to St. Teresa's College. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you all for attending with your masks on. Now I should bye-bye.
Thank you so much, and we are really happy that there was so much of response from the public, and I'm sure Manu will be back with something innovative, and his book, we are all eagerly waiting for the next book. I'm sure that is already conceived, and we are breathlessly waiting for the new book. Maybe in a year or 2, we'll be holding it in our hands, and the release definitely would happen at St. Teresa's College. And